What should have been a peaceful flight turns into a shocking scene when a mistress pours water over a pregnant woman in front of an entire cabin, while the husband sits there and does nothing. He believes silence will protect him. She believes humiliation will give her power. But neither of them notices who is standing only a few steps away, watching everything with trained eyes and forced restraint. Because the flight attendant they are trying to ignore is not just doing her job, she is the pregnant woman's sister. What follows is a brutal collision of cruelty, authority, and truth, unfolding high above the ground, where escape is impossible, and justice has nowhere to hide. Stay with us, because the moment control shifts will hit harder than anyone expects. Tell us where you are listening from and when you pressed play. Drop a comment below and join the story. The aircraft had already reached cruising altitude when the cabin lights softened, shifting into a gentle glow that usually signaled safety and routine. The steady hum of the engines blended with quiet conversations and the rustle of magazines. For most passengers, this moment meant release, a pause between departure and arrival. No one in the cabin could sense that this calm was fragile, or that a single reckless choice was about to tear through the quiet in a way that could not be undone. Anna Reynolds sat in the middle section of the cabin, her back pressed carefully against the seat, her movements slow and deliberate. At 29, 7 months pregnant, she had learned to listen closely to her body. She wore a pale yellow maternity dress that fell loosely over her belly, soft fabric chosen for comfort rather than appearance. One hand rested instinctively on her stomach, fingers spread protectively, as if she could shield the life inside her from the world beyond the seatback. From the moment she stepped onto the plane, Anna had known that her younger sister was working this flight. She had checked the schedule the night before, memorizing the route, the crew assignment, even the expected duration. Emily Reynolds, 26, was not just a flight attendant on this aircraft, she was Anna's sister. Anna had made a conscious decision to treat that knowledge like a secret she carried alone. On a plane, family ties had no official place, and Anna refused to risk Emily's career by blurring those lines. As passengers settled, Anna felt the subtle shift in the air when Emily moved down the aisle. Emily wore her navy blue flight attendant uniform, perfectly pressed, the matching hat secured neatly in place, a red and white scarf tied at her neck. Her posture was straight, her expression composed. When their eyes met briefly, it was not a greeting, but a recognition. A flicker of emotion passed between them, then disappeared. Emily continued walking, and Anna looked down to adjust her seatbelt, as if nothing had happened. Anna told herself she was strong enough for this flight. She had boarded with that belief firmly in place. All she had to do was sit still, breathe evenly, and wait for the plane to land. The choice to stay silent was deliberate. She would not draw attention, would not create a scene, would not place Emily in a position where duty and blood might collide. A few rows behind her, Claire Morgan sat upright in her seat, her posture rigid, her attention fixed entirely on Anna. Claire was 31, dressed in a fitted red dress that hugged her figure and demanded attention. The color stood out sharply against the muted tones of the cabin. In her eyes burned a resentment that had been building for weeks, fueled by jealousy and a constant need to assert dominance. Beside Claire sat Mark Reynolds, Anna's husband. At 34, he looked composed in a light-colored dress shirt and dark trousers, his sleeves neatly buttoned, his demeanor detached. He leaned slightly toward Claire, murmuring something low enough that only she could hear. Claire's lips curved into a faint smile. The sound of her restrained laughter floated forward, light but cutting. Anna heard it. She heard everything. She chose not to turn around. Instead, she angled her face toward the window, watching clouds drift past like slow-moving islands. She focused on the horizon, on the illusion of distance, on anything that could pull her mind away from the tension tightening her chest. She inhaled carefully, exhaled slowly, reminding herself that stress was dangerous, that calm was necessary, that her child depended on her restraint. A gentle movement inside her belly broke through her concentration. The baby shifted, a subtle but unmistakable reminder of life. Anna's hand pressed more firmly against her stomach. her thumb tracing a small circle through the thin fabric of her dress. She whispered nothing, but her thoughts were clear. She was not alone, and that knowledge steadied her. Claire watched the gesture closely. To her, Anna's silence did not look like strength. It looked like surrender. Claire's gaze lingered on the curve of the yellow dress. On the way, Anna's shoulders remained still, her head bowed slightly. In Claire's mind, this was the posture of defeat. The plastic cup on Claire's tray table caught her attention. It was half filled with water, condensation beading along the sides. She lifted it, then set it back down. Her fingers tightened around it a second time. The decision was forming, fueled by anger and encouraged by the absence of resistance. Mark noticed the movement. He glanced at the cup, then at Claire's face. He said nothing. His silence was not neutral. It was permission. Around them, other passengers shifted in their seats, oblivious or unwilling to notice the tension coiling in the row behind Anna. A man across the aisle flipped a page in his book. A child further back kicked the seat in front of him, then stopped when his mother whispered a warning. The cabin appeared calm, but the air felt heavier, as if charged. Anna sensed eyes on her back. She felt it like pressure, an awareness that made her spine stiffen. Still, she did not turn. She believed that if she did nothing, if she remained invisible, the moment would pass. She trusted in restraint because it had become her survival strategy. Further down the aisle, Emily moved between rows, assisting passengers with practiced ease. She smiled politely, answered a question, adjusted an overhead bin. Her attention never fully left her surroundings. When she glanced forward, she caught sight of Anna's familiar posture, the pale yellow dress unmistakable, even from a distance. A flicker of concern passed through her, but she continued working. Protocol mattered. Order mattered. The space between the sisters felt vast, despite the short physical distance. It was a fragile boundary held together by discipline and love. Claire lifted the cup again. This time, she did not hesitate. The decision was complete, sealed by jealousy and the certainty that no one would stop her. In that suspended moment, while the plane cruised steadily above the clouds, a single impulsive act waited to be unleashed, ready to shatter the silence and mark the beginning of something that would never be forgotten. The tension did not arrive all at once. It crept in through attention, through the way one gaze refused to look away. Claire watched Anna from behind, measuring every still movement, every breath that did not waver. The calm felt deliberate. To Claire, it was not patience or restraint. It was defiance disguised as silence. She leaned forward slightly, not enough to draw notice, just enough to feel closer. The space between them narrowed, and with it came a strange sense of permission. Claire told herself she was not doing anything. She was only watching. Yet the focus sharpened, and the watching became fixation. Mark noticed the shift immediately. He followed the direction of Claire's eyes, then looked back at her. His reaction was minimal, a faint change in expression that might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. To Claire, it meant everything. There was no warning in his face, no concern, no reason to stop. The absence of restraint felt like encouragement. Anna sensed the change without turning. She had learned to recognize pressure in quiet forms. It lived in the air, in the way sounds grew sharper, in the pause between breaths. Still, she remained facing forward. She refused to give the tension a shape by acknowledging it. She believed that attention was fuel, and she would not provide it. Claire's hands tightened, then relaxed, then tightened again. Her breathing shortened, quick and shallow, as thoughts began to spiral. She replayed the past weeks in fragments, conversations that never resolved, promises that felt increasingly hollow. Each memory sharpened her resentment. The calm in front of her became unbearable. Mark leaned closer and murmured something low. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. It was not a warning. It was not an attempt to slow her down. It carried the weight of familiarity and certainty. Claire felt seen in that moment, validated in a way that silenced doubt. Across the aisle, a passenger shifted uncomfortably. The movement was brief, a glance exchanged with another, then eyes forward again. No one wanted to be involved. In confined spaces, avoidance often passed for wisdom. Anna adjusted her position slightly, the movement careful and controlled. She focused on keeping her breathing steady. Calm was not a choice anymore, it was a requirement. The life inside her responded to stress in ways she could feel. She placed her hand where it belonged and centered herself. Endurance had become second nature. Claire misread the gesture. She saw it as confirmation of weakness, as proof that silence came from fear. The thought hardened her resolve. In her mind, action began to feel necessary, even justified. Doing nothing no longer felt like an option. Mark said nothing else. He did not reach for Claire's arm or offer a glance meant to restrain. His silence pressed into the space between them, heavy and final. It told her she was alone in responsibility, but not alone in consequence. The cabin continued its routine. Pages turned. A drink cart rattled softly in the distance. The engines maintained their steady rhythm. Outside the windows, clouds drifted past, indifferent to what was building inside. Claire scanned the aisle briefly. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their attention divided among passengers. No one was watching her. The realization brought a dangerous sense of freedom. Anna felt eyes on her back again, the sensation sharp and unmistakable. She resisted the urge to turn. She had learned that reaction invited escalation. If she remained still, perhaps the moment would dissolve. Perhaps restraint would win. Emily moved down the aisle, attentive and composed. She assisted a passenger, answered a quiet question, then continued. Her gaze flicked forward for a fraction of a second, catching a familiar outline. Concern stirred, subtle but real. She kept moving. Procedure came first. It always did. The distance between the sisters felt wider than the aisle that separated them. It was held together by discipline and trust, by the belief that restraint would be enough. Claire's thoughts circled back to the same point. Silence was not neutrality. It was a challenge. She told herself that if Anna would not acknowledge the situation, then she would force it into the open. The idea settled with unsettling clarity. Mark turned his attention forward, disengaging from the tension as if it no longer concerned him. The choice was deliberate. He did not want to be the one to intervene. Responsibility could be avoided if he refused to see it. The hum of the engines remained constant, a reminder of how little room there was for error. The cabin was a closed system. Every action would echo. Claire shifted again, leaning closer than before. The proximity felt like crossing a line, but the line had already blurred in her mind. She told herself that no one would stop her, that no one could. The certainty grew with every passing second. Anna focused inward, counting breaths, grounding herself in the present. She believed that control was possible, that patience would protect her. She did not know how close the moment was to breaking. Emily paused briefly at the end of the aisle, her posture unchanged. She sensed something, a disturbance beneath the routine. She made a mental note, then resumed her duties. The rules existed for a reason. Claire's breathing slowed, not from calm, but from decision. The path ahead felt clear, frighteningly so. She no longer questioned whether she should act. She questioned only when. Mark remained silent, his presence a constant weight. His refusal to intervene removed the last barrier. In the absence of opposition, intent solidified. Around them, the cabin continued to function as if nothing were wrong. Conversations murmured, screens flickered. The world carried on. Claire held her position, waiting for the right second. The tension stretched, thin and taut, ready to snap. The choice had already been made. What remained was timing. Anna remained still, unaware that restraint was about to be mistaken for surrender. She trusted silence to keep the peace, not knowing how quickly silence could be turned against her. The plane moved forward through the sky, steady and unyielding, carrying with it a conflict that had not yet found its outlet. The fracture had formed. It only needed pressure to split wide open. The movement came without warning. 1 second the cabin held its breath. The next a sudden jolt ran through the row as Claire stood up sharply, the seat behind her rocking from the force. Heads turned. A few passengers froze mid-motion, caught between curiosity and unease. She moved fast. There was no announcement, no raised voice, no pause that might have invited interruption. She closed the distance in a handful of steps, the aisle narrowing as if it were pulling her forward. By the time anyone understood what was happening, she was already there. Anna did not have time to turn. The moment stretched thin and brittle as a cup rose into view. Light from the cabin lamps glinted on the surface of the water, a brief reflection that felt unreal, almost suspended. Then the water came down. It struck without mercy, cold and shocking, as it spilled over her head and face. The sensation was immediate and overwhelming. Anna cried out, a sharp sound torn from her before she could stop it. Her body recoiled, shoulders hunching as the shock raced through her. The water streamed down her hair, along her neck, soaking into the fabric at her chest and waist. It clung to her skin, heavy and invasive. The humiliation landed just as hard as the cold, amplified by the sudden silence that followed. Instinct took over. Anna raised both hands toward her head, fingers splayed in a reflexive attempt to shield herself. Almost at the same time, one hand dropped protectively to her belly. The shift was automatic, driven by something deeper than thought. In that moment, nothing mattered more than the child she carried. Gasps rippled through the surrounding rows. Several passengers stood abruptly, seats creaking as bodies moved at once. Voices overlapped in confusion and alarm. The orderly rhythm of the cabin shattered. A child began to cry, the sound thin and panicked. Another voice called out in disbelief. The confined space magnified every reaction, turning shock into noise, noise into chaos. Claire did not step back. She remained where she was, chest rising and falling, eyes bright and fixed. There was no regret in her expression, no sign that she wished the moment undone. If anything, there was satisfaction there, sharpened by defiance. Mark rose from his seat more slowly, as if the moment belonged to him as well. He did not reach for Anna. Instead, he positioned himself near Claire, his body angled between her and the others. The gesture was familiar, almost practiced, and it spoke louder than any words. Anna trembled, her whole body reacting to the shock. Cold seeped deeper as the water continued to drip, pooling at her feet. She grabbed the edge of a seat to steady herself, fingers gripping hard enough to ache. The floor felt unsteady beneath her, or perhaps it was only her legs that refused to cooperate. Someone shouted for help. Another demanded that something be done, yet no one moved close enough to intervene. Fear held them back, the unspoken understanding that in this space, escalation could be dangerous. Claire turned her head slowly, taking in the faces around her. She seemed to register the attention with a sense of triumph. Being seen mattered. Being acknowledged mattered more than consequences she had not yet considered. Mark spoke then, his voice flat, dismissive. He said it was a misunderstanding. The words fell heavily, absurd in their inadequacy. They landed on Anna like another blow, confirming what she already knew. Anna's breathing grew uneven as she fought to remain upright. She pressed her hand more firmly against her belly, grounding herself through touch. The instinct to protect burned hotter than fear, hotter than shame. A passenger closer to the aisle finally stepped forward, voice raised, demanding that the situation stop. Others echoed the call, their anger gaining strength now that the first barrier had broken. The cabin filled with sound, overlapping reactions colliding in the narrow space. Claire did not apologize. She did not explain. She held her ground, chin lifted, daring anyone to challenge her. The moment had crossed a threshold, and she seemed to know it. Anna lowered herself back into her seat with difficulty, guided by hands that appeared from nowhere. She focused on breathing, on staying present, on the rhythm that would keep her conscious. The cold clung to her, but she forced herself to remain still. The plane continued its steady course through the sky, indifferent to the turmoil inside. Outside, nothing had changed. Inside, everything had. This was no longer a private tension or a silent conflict. It had spilled into the open, undeniable and irreversible. The line had been crossed, and the weight of that crossing settled over everyone involved. There would be no undoing this moment. No explanation could erase it. No silence could contain it again. What had happened now existed, fixed and undeniable, marking the point where restraint ended and consequence began. Silence became her shield. Anna lowered her head as water continued to drip from her hair onto the cabin floor. She did not argue. She did not cry out for help. The absence of sound around her felt heavier than any protest could have been. It was not confusion that held her still. It was choice. She knew her sister was on this flight. That knowledge sat firmly in her chest, steady and unyielding. Still, she kept her eyes fixed downward, refusing to look toward the aisle. Turning her head would be enough to change everything. She would not do that. Not yet. In her mind, one priority stood above all others: the safety of the flight, the work her sister had committed herself to. Her own anger did not matter in comparison. She would not allow her pain to become a public disruption that pulled her sister into the center of chaos. Claire watched closely and misunderstood the silence completely. To her, the lack of response felt like victory. If there was no resistance, then there was no threat. She began to speak again, her words sharp, designed to wound. Each insult landed harder because it was unanswered. Mark remained standing near her, his posture relaxed in a way that felt almost casual. He nodded along as if agreement were natural, as if this outcome made sense. He did not realize that every second of his indifference was building a case against him. The cabin reacted in waves. At first, there were murmurs, then raised voices. Passengers began to object, anger spreading through the rows as people processed what they had witnessed. Discomfort turned into outrage, and outrage demanded response. Anna felt the shift, but did not lift her head. The noise around her blurred as a wave of dizziness washed over her. For a brief moment, the world tilted. She gripped the armrest tightly, anchoring herself to the seat. She forced her breathing to slow, counting each inhale and exhale with care. She whispered to the life inside her, words meant only for herself. Her voice trembled, but her resolve did not. The child came first. That truth grounded her when everything else threatened to pull her apart. Claire took another step forward, closing what little distance remained. The movement was subtle, but aggressive, an attempt to dominate through proximity. The space felt dangerous now, charged and unstable. Mark did nothing to stop her. If anything, he appeared irritated by the passengers who had begun to speak up. He gestured dismissively, as if the objections were an inconvenience rather than a response to harm. He believed control was still within reach. An older passenger stood, his voice firm as he called for a flight attendant. The sound cut through the cabin clearly, impossible to ignore. Others echoed him, their demands gaining strength. The balance shifted again. Anna did not turn. Her jaw tightened, lips pressed together as she endured. She would not search the aisle for her sister. She refused to force that moment before it was necessary. Holding that line took more strength than any confrontation could have. At the far end of the cabin, Emily had seen everything. She stood still for a moment, her body frozen as reality caught up with her. Her heart pounded, each beat loud in her ears. Training held her in place, rules running through her mind in rapid sequence. Observe, assess, maintain order. But this was not an abstract situation. This was her sister. Emily remained where she was, eyes fixed on the scene ahead. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, then slowly relaxed. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to stay present. The urge to move was powerful, almost overwhelming. Professional discipline demanded restraint. Personal instinct demanded action. Inside her, those two forces collided. Anna continued to sit in silence, unaware of the exact moment her sister had fully registered what was happening. She focused inward, holding herself together through sheer will. The noise of the cabin faded into a distant echo as she concentrated on staying upright. Claire mistook the continued silence as confirmation. Her confidence grew, warped and unchecked. She spoke again, louder this time, feeding off the attention she believed she had earned. Mark remained at her side, his presence reinforcing her stance. He did not notice the expressions around him changing. He did not see how quickly sympathy had shifted away from him and toward the woman he refused to defend. Passengers exchanged looks of disbelief. Phones were lowered, hands tightened on armrests. The mood had turned decisively against the aggressors, and the shift was unmistakable. Emily took a small step forward, then stopped herself. She was still on duty, still responsible for every passenger on board, still bound by protocol. But her gaze never left Anna. She assessed the situation with clear eyes now. The risk to a pregnant passenger, the rising agitation in the cabin, the failure of those involved to de-escalate. The moment was approaching where inaction would become negligence. Anna's silence was beginning to strain. Her shoulders trembled slightly as the physical effects of stress took their toll. She steadied herself again, refusing to break. The choice to remain silent was becoming heavier by the second. Claire leaned in once more, her presence looming. The boundary had all but disappeared. The danger was no longer hypothetical. Mark still did not intervene. Emily felt the shift before anyone else. The air had changed. The moment of observation was ending. The moment of decision was arriving. She drew in a breath and held it, her mind racing through procedure and consequence. Whatever happened next would alter the course of the flight. It would alter relationships. It would alter everything. Anna remained facing forward, unaware that the silence she had chosen was pushing someone else toward a breaking point. Her restraint had reached its limit, even if she did not yet know it. The cabin held its breath again, caught between discipline and instinct, between order and justice. This silence could not last much longer. Emily stood in the center aisle with the service folder pressed tightly against her palm. She had seen everything. The moment the water was lifted, the instant it fell, the way the sound of shock spread through the cabin, faster than words. From where she stood, there was no confusion about what had happened. There was only the weight of witnessing it. For the first few seconds, she forced herself to remain still. Training took over before emotion could. Safety procedures did not allow impulsive reactions. A flight attendant did not rush forward without assessing the risk. Even now, even with her heart pounding, she knew that acting on instinct alone could make everything worse. Her eyes stayed fixed on Anna. The sight of her sister shaking, cold and disoriented, sent a sharp pain through her chest. Emily felt it physically, like pressure just beneath her ribs. She wanted to move, to speak, to place herself between Anna and the threat. Instead, she stood her ground, forcing logic to stay in control. She began to observe the aggressors carefully. Claire's posture, her breathing, the way she occupied space. Mark's position beside her, his lack of restraint, his refusal to de-escalate. Emily evaluated them not as family or strangers, but as potential risks inside a closed environment. This was no longer a private conflict. It was a safety concern. Several passengers had raised their phones. The quiet glow of screens appeared between seats, unmistakable. Recording meant attention. Attention meant escalation. Emily knew this was a turning point. Once cameras were involved, every move would be scrutinized. Any misstep could ripple outward beyond the flight itself. Claire continued speaking, her voice sharp and unfiltered. There was no sign of regret. Each word carried contempt, as if silence had given her permission to go further. Emily noted the pattern. There was no intention to stop. Mark attempted to counter the rising outrage with threats that carried no authority. His voice grew louder, more aggressive, as if volume alone could restore control. Emily recognized the danger immediately. Raised voices in a confined space invited panic. Panic endangered everyone. She drew in a slow breath, steadying herself. This was not the moment yet. She had to be certain. Intervention too early could provoke a stronger reaction. Intervention too late could mean injury. Timing mattered. Emily glanced toward her colleagues. A brief look, a subtle signal. No words were needed. They had trained together long enough to read the message. Be ready. Stay alert. Prepare to assist. Anna accepted a tissue from a nearby passenger. She took it with a slight nod, her head still lowered. The gesture was quiet, dignified. Emily saw how hard her sister was working just to remain upright. The tremor in her hands had grown more pronounced. That detail shifted everything. Emily recognized the signs immediately. Shock, cold exposure, stress. Combined with pregnancy, the situation had crossed into medical concern. This was no longer about conflict management alone. Health was now a factor. Her pulse quickened, but her movements remained measured. She stepped forward one pace, closing the distance without drawing attention to herself. Eyes followed her instinctively. The cabin seemed to register her presence all at once. Claire noticed the movement but dismissed it. Her focus remained locked on Anna. She believed she was still in control, still commanding the moment. Emily noted that confidence and marked it as dangerous. Mark's attention flicked toward Emily, irritation flashing across his face. He did not recognize her beyond her uniformed role. To him, she was just another obstacle. That miscalculation would matter. Emily took another breath and held it briefly. She reviewed the sequence in her mind. Announce presence, establish authority, separate parties, assess the condition of the pregnant passenger, call for additional support if needed. Every step aligned itself into place. She stepped forward again, now clearly within the field of attention. Conversations quieted, the energy shifted. The cabin leaned toward resolution without fully realizing it. Claire scoffed, muttering something dismissive. She did not step back. She did not soften her stance. Emily observed, without reacting. Emotional engagement would only fuel resistance. Mark turned his body slightly, positioning himself as a barrier. The move was instinctive, territorial. Emily did not challenge it yet. She simply noted it. Around them, passengers waited. Some stood, others clutched armrests. The expectation was palpable. Someone needed to take control. Someone needed to act with authority. Emily felt the weight of that responsibility settle onto her shoulders. This was the moment training existed for. Not the routine service, not the rehearsed announcements. She took one more step forward, close enough now to read the tension in their faces clearly. She did not raise her voice. She did not rush. Calm was her strongest tool. Behind her, she sensed her colleagues positioning themselves, ready to support whatever came next. The cabin crew moved like a quiet current, unseen but prepared. Anna remained silent, unaware of how close intervention truly was. She focused on breathing, on staying conscious, on protecting what mattered most. Emily saw the strain and knew the window was narrowing. Claire continued to speak, emboldened by the delay. Each word pushed the situation closer to collapse. Emily recognized that any further escalation could tip the balance into physical confrontation. Mark said nothing now. His earlier confidence had shifted into irritation. He underestimated the shift in authority unfolding around him. Emily stood fully upright, her posture firm, her presence undeniable. She did not speak yet. The silence itself carried weight. It signaled that the moment of observation had ended. The time for calculation was nearly over. She met Anna's eyes briefly for the first time since the incident. It was a fleeting glance, barely perceptible to anyone else. In that instant, understanding passed between them. Not reassurance, not explanation, just readiness. Emily drew in a controlled breath. The cabin held still with her. The moment of official intervention was seconds away. Emily stepped fully into the center of the aisle, placing herself where every eye could see her. Her voice cut through the noise with clear authority, firm and controlled, calling for order. The tone was professional and precise, the kind that left little room for argument. The cabin responded almost immediately, the volume dropping as attention focused on her. She addressed Claire first, instructing her to return to her seat and comply with flight safety regulations. There was no accusation in the words, no raised emotion, only policy and expectation. The message was simple. This behavior was not permitted on board. Claire responded with a short laugh, dismissive and sharp. She suggested the situation was being exaggerated, that there was no need for such intervention. The reaction did not soften the moment, it tightened it. Several passengers shifted in their seats, tension settling heavier than before. Mark stepped forward, his voice rising as he challenged Emily's authority. He spoke as if proximity could sway the outcome, as if confidence alone could override procedure. He believed he could argue his way through, that this was a matter of personal disagreement rather than public safety. Emily did not retreat. She kept her voice level, but her expression cooled. She issued a warning, stating that any further disruptive behavior would be formally documented. The words carried weight. Documentation meant consequences beyond the flight. Anna was gently guided toward an empty seat closer to the aisle. Her movements were slow and careful, each step measured. She leaned slightly for support, her balance unsteady. The relocation was quiet and deliberate. designed to reduce risk without drawing further attention. A towel was brought forward and offered to her. She accepted it with a nod, using it to dry her face and neck. The warmth provided a small measure of relief, though the shock lingered. Her breathing remained uneven, but she focused on steadying herself. Around them, passengers began to sit back down. Conversations did not resume. Eyes remained fixed on the scene. Curiosity and concern kept the cabin alert. The sense of danger had not passed. It had merely paused. Claire continued to speak, her voice louder now, frustration spilling over. She refused to calm down, insisting she had done nothing wrong. Each sentence added fuel to the situation, pushing it closer to a breaking point. Mark echoed her anger, claiming the issue was a private family matter. The argument drew immediate backlash. Passengers protested loudly, rejecting the idea that such behavior could be excused. The cabin fractured into opposing voices. Emily activated her internal device, recording the ongoing behavior. The action was subtle but significant. Evidence was being preserved. Every word and movement now carried lasting implications. Anna lowered her head, tears slipping silently down her face. She did not speak. She knew Emily was nearby, that help was present, but she remained quiet, conserving what strength she had left. Emily allowed herself a brief glance toward her sister. It lasted less than a second, but it was enough. Concern and resolve passed between them without words. Then Emily turned back to the situation at hand. Claire stepped forward again, closing distance she had already been instructed to keep. The movement crossed a clear boundary. It was no longer defiance alone, it was escalation. Emily straightened her posture, positioning herself squarely between Claire and Anna. Her presence was unmistakable now. She was no longer observing, she was intervening. She stated clearly that the behavior would not continue. The words were measured, deliberate, and final. The cabin seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the response. Claire hesitated, then scoffed, attempting to push past the warning. The attempt failed. Passengers reacted instantly, voices rising in protest. The collective response left no doubt. Support had shifted decisively. Mark tried once more to speak over the noise, but his words were drowned out. Authority no longer rested with him. It had moved. Emily took another step forward, maintaining control of the space. She explained the consequences calmly, outlining what would happen if instructions were not followed. There was no threat in her voice, only certainty. Anna remained seated, clutching the towel, her breathing gradually slowing. The immediate danger felt contained, though the emotional weight pressed heavily on her. Claire's posture faltered for the first time. The realization that the situation was no longer in her control flickered across her face. She had pushed too far. Emily waited, giving space for compliance. The silence that followed was thick, charged, and irreversible. This was the moment where choice still existed, but only just. She stood tall, prepared to speak again if necessary. Whatever came next would set the course for everything that followed. Emily looked directly at Claire, no longer maintaining the neutral distance required moments earlier. Her gaze hardened, steady and unyielding. Whatever hesitation had existed before was gone. In its place stood certainty, sharpened by resolve. The cabin fell into complete silence. It was not the quiet of calm, but the quiet that followed impact, as if every sound had been swallowed at once. Passengers sensed that something irreversible was about to happen. Even before any words were spoken, Emily drew in one last measured breath. When she spoke, her voice was clear and firm, carrying without strain across the aisle. There was no tremor in it, no raised pitch, only control. Her sister. The words cut cleanly through the space. They did not echo, but their weight lingered, stopping every forming excuse in its tracks. For a brief instant, time seemed suspended. Faces froze, hands stilled. The cabin held its breath as if unsure how to move forward. Claire stared, confusion flashing across her face before understanding took hold. The shift was visible, confidence drained away, replaced by disbelief. The realization struck hard and fast, unraveling the certainty she had clung to only seconds earlier. Mark's color faded. He took a half step back without thinking, his body reacting before his mind could catch up. The dynamic he believed he controlled had flipped in a single sentence, and he had not seen it coming. Anna closed her eyes and broke down quietly. Tears flowed without restraint, the release long delayed. She did not call out. She did not need to. The moment had already reached her. The truth was now exposed to everyone on board. The relationship that had been hidden behind procedure and restraint stood revealed in the open. There was nothing left to obscure it. Murmurs rippled through the cabin, then grew into open reaction. Passengers exchanged looks, shock giving way to anger. Sympathy shifted decisively, aligning itself with the woman who had endured in silence. Claire attempted to speak, lips parting as if to form a defense. The effort failed. Words tangled and fell apart before they could become sentences. Whatever authority she had claimed vanished. Mark tried to regain his composure, drawing in a breath that shook despite his effort. He opened his mouth, searching for a response that would restore balance. None came. Every argument he had relied on now sounded hollow, stripped of power by the truth. Emily said nothing more. She did not need to. She held her posture, shoulders squared, eyes forward. The silence she maintained carried more force than further explanation ever could. Passengers leaned forward in their seats, attention fixed. No one looked toward Claire or Mark with sympathy anymore. The collective judgment was unmistakable. Anna wiped her face with trembling hands, still seated, still catching her breath. The presence she had avoided calling upon had arrived on its own terms, and it changed everything. Claire glanced around, realizing she was no longer the center of control, but the center of scrutiny. The awareness unsettled her. For the first time, she appeared unsure of her footing. Mark swallowed and looked away. The confidence that once anchored him had eroded. He stood exposed, his earlier indifference now recast as complicity. Emily remained motionless, allowing the truth to settle. She understood the power of restraint, the way it could amplify meaning. By not adding anything, she let the moment define itself. The cabin chose its side without being asked. No one spoke up in defense of those who had caused harm. The collective will had shifted, quiet but absolute. Claire's shoulders sagged slightly as the weight of the situation pressed in. The authority she believed she possessed dissolved under the gaze of dozens of witnesses. Mark attempted one final breath, as if steadiness might return through sheer will. It did not. His voice, when he tried to speak again, failed him entirely. Emily stood firm, the embodiment of control. She did not advance or retreat. She simply held the line. The silence deepened, heavy and undeniable. It was the kind that followed a verdict, not a question. In that stillness, power found its place, not through force or volume, but through truth spoken once and allowed to stand. The balance within the cabin had been set. The response was immediate. Emily activated the security protocol without hesitation. Her hand moved with precision as she notified the cockpit, her voice calm and controlled as she relayed the situation. Every step followed procedure exactly. There was no confusion, no delay, no room for interpretation. The system was now in motion. Claire was instructed to remain seated and to keep her distance from Anna. The command was firm and final, delivered without emotion. There would be no argument, no negotiation. The boundary was clear and enforced. Mark received a formal warning for interfering with the intervention. The words landed heavily. For the first time since the incident began, reality reached him. The situation was no longer contained within the cabin. It had entered official record, and consequences were no longer abstract. Several passengers stepped forward, offering themselves as witnesses. Phones were held steady, videos preserved rather than deleted. What had been recorded would remain intact. Truth now had multiple angles and no escape. The cabin settled into a different kind of quiet. It was not calm, but judgment. Conversations ceased. Laughter disappeared entirely. The air carried a weight that pressed down on everyone. A shared understanding that something serious had occurred. Anna's condition was assessed where she sat. Her breathing, once erratic, began to slow under careful guidance. She focused on steady inhales, steady exhales, grounding herself in the moment. The immediate danger eased, though the shock had not fully released its grip. Emily stayed close without crossing professional lines. She did not hover, but she did not leave. Her presence served two purposes at once: protection and duty. Neither compromised the other. Claire's composure unraveled. She looked around the cabin, searching for sympathy, for alliance, for anything that might restore her footing. She found none. Eyes met hers only briefly, before turning away. The isolation was unmistakable. Mark lowered his gaze. He avoided eye contact with those around him, his earlier arrogance replaced by a tight, inward silence. The shift was complete. He understood now that the crowd had turned against him. Confirmation came from the cockpit that security personnel would be waiting upon landing. The information moved quickly through the cabin, carried in hushed exchanges. Heads nodded. The message was clear. This was not ending in the air. Passengers exchanged looks that carried more than words could. They understood that the flight would continue, but the story would not conclude here. There was a sense of inevitability in the air, as if the outcome had already been written. Anna leaned back against the seat, drawing strength from stillness. Her body gradually responded to the absence of immediate threat. She felt the space around her change. What had once felt hostile now felt guarded. The difference was tangible. Emily documented every detail: times, statements, movements. Nothing was overlooked. The record formed carefully, line by line, ensuring that the events would be preserved exactly as they occurred. Claire sat rigid, hands trembling in her lap. The realization settled slowly but completely. She had crossed a boundary that could not be erased. The understanding brought fear, sharp and unrelenting. Mark remained silent, his shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of scrutiny pressing down. He did not attempt to justify himself again. He no longer had the confidence to do so. The cabin crew maintained order with quiet efficiency. There were no raised voices now, only controlled movements and measured instructions. The system worked as it was designed to. Anna closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. She was still here. She was protected. That knowledge steadied her more than anything else could. Emily checked in discreetly, ensuring stability without drawing attention. The balance between care and protocol held firm. She did not break character, but the concern in her eyes was unmistakable. Claire remained motionless, her breathing shallow. She stared ahead, no longer defiant, no longer bold. The power she believed she had vanished, replaced by uncertainty. Mark shifted in his seat, uncomfortable under the weight of collective judgment. He avoided looking at Anna, avoided looking at Emily, avoided looking at anyone at all. The flight continued on its path, smooth and unwavering. Outside, the sky remained unchanged. Inside, the transformation was complete. Passengers settled back into their seats, but attention lingered. This was not curiosity, it was awareness. The understanding that accountability had been activated, even at 30,000 feet. Anna rested her hands together, focusing on calm. The tension in her body slowly released, replaced by exhaustion. She was no longer alone in bearing what had happened. Emily completed her notes and secured them. The documentation was thorough. Nothing would be lost to memory or interpretation. The truth was now fixed. Claire's hands shook more noticeably. She looked down, finally comprehending the gravity of her actions. There would be no easy explanation, no dismissal. Mark exhaled slowly, his posture closed. The arrogance that once defined him had dissolved completely. The cabin moved forward in silence, not out of fear, but out of recognition. The matter was no longer open for debate. Justice had been set in motion above the clouds. What remained would be decided on the ground. The aircraft touched down smoothly, but the cabin remained silent. There was no applause, no relieved laughter, none of the small rituals passengers usually shared after landing. The wheels met the runway and rolled forward, carrying with them the weight of everything that had happened in the air. Every person on board understood that this flight had already crossed a line long before it reached the ground. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, the doors stayed closed longer than usual. Outside, figures waited with purpose. Airport security and police officers stood ready, their presence visible through the narrow windows. When the door finally opened, they stepped onto the aircraft without delay. Their movements were calm, professional, and decisive. Claire was asked to stand first. The request was firm and unmistakable. As she rose, every eye in the cabin followed her. The earlier confidence she had carried was gone. Her shoulders were tense, her face drained of color. She took a step forward, then another, walking past rows of silent passengers who watched without sympathy. Shame clung to her openly now, with nowhere left to hide. The accusation was stated clearly: assault against a pregnant woman. The words carried no drama, only fact. There was no room for excuses, no opportunity for reinterpretation. The incident had been witnessed, recorded, and confirmed. Claire did not argue. She did not protest. Her silence said more than any defense could have. Mark was instructed to remain seated. When his turn came, it was not with urgency, but with certainty. He was informed that he would be detained for questioning due to his role in enabling the incident and attempting to obstruct intervention. The realization struck him visibly. His jaw tightened. His hands curled against the armrests. There was no path left open for escape. Passengers were asked to remain seated for a brief moment longer. No one complained. No one sighed or shifted impatiently. They understood their role now, not as bystanders, but as witnesses. Phones were lowered only after officers confirmed that recordings had been secured properly. The process was efficient and thorough. Claire turned once, glancing back toward Mark. Her look searched for reassurance, for connection, for something familiar. Mark did not meet her eyes. He stared down instead, as if avoiding her could erase the reality unfolding around him. In that moment, whatever fragile bond they had shared collapsed completely. Anna was then assisted to stand. She was given priority to exit the aircraft. The movement was slow, deliberate. Her body was still recovering from shock, but her steps were steady. Each one carried quiet strength. The cabin parted for her without a word. No one rushed her. No one looked away either. Emily moved to her side, guiding her gently toward a separate exit path. This time, there was no professional distance. There was only presence. The line between duty and family no longer existed. They walked together, shoulder to shoulder, as equals. As they reached the doorway, Anna paused briefly. She looked back at the cabin that had become a place of fear, then transformation. Her eyes met Emily's. The exchange held everything they did not need to say. Relief. Gratitude. Recognition. No words followed. None were necessary. Mark was escorted next. His movements were slow, heavy. He kept his head down, avoiding every gaze directed at him. The arrogance that once defined him had vanished entirely. He did not resist. He did not speak. His silence reflected defeat, not dignity. Claire disappeared beyond the security doors moments later. The woman who had boarded the plane with confidence and cruelty was gone. What remained was a reality she could not control. The separation was final, enforced not by emotion, but by consequence. Passengers were finally allowed to stand and gather their belongings. Still, the cabin did not return to normal conversation. People moved quietly, processing what they had seen. Some exchanged brief looks, nods that acknowledged shared understanding. Others remained inward, replaying moments in their minds. The flight crew maintained composure throughout. Instructions were given calmly. Procedures were completed methodically. Even in aftermath, professionalism held firm. The system had done what it was meant to do. Outside the aircraft, Anna was guided toward medical staff waiting nearby. Her condition was assessed again, her vital signs stable. The danger had passed, but care continued. She leaned slightly, not from weakness, but from exhaustion. The tension had finally released. Emily remained close, offering reassurance without crowding. The role she had played on the flight was finished, but her presence was not. She stayed until she was certain Anna was secure. Mark was led away separately, flanked by officers. He did not look back. There was nothing left behind that could save him. The crowd he once assumed would support him had turned into witnesses against him. Claire was no longer visible. She had vanished into process, into record, into consequence. The confidence she once wielded meant nothing now. Passengers slowly filtered into the terminal. Conversations began again, but they were different, lower, more thoughtful. What they had witnessed would not fade quickly. The aircraft door closed behind them. Inside that metal shell, a chapter had ended. Chaos had unfolded. Power had shifted. Accountability had been enforced. The sky had been the stage, but the resolution belonged to the ground. Justice had not arrived with noise or spectacle. It had arrived with procedure, with witnesses, with calm certainty. And as the plane stood empty at the gate, it carried no applause. Only the quiet proof that what happened in the air could never be undone. But it had not been ignored. Medical staff met Anna at the terminal without delay. The assessment was calm and efficient, focused on reassurance rather than urgency. Initial readings showed stability. Her pulse settled. Her breathing evened out. The sharp edge of fear that had followed her from the cabin finally loosened its grip. The confirmation that mattered most came quietly. The baby was safe. Hearing those words allowed Anna to release a breath she had been holding for far too long. Relief moved through her in a slow wave, replacing shock with something gentler. For the first time since the incident began, her body responded to peace. Emily remained beside her, sitting close enough to be felt without crowding. She held Anna's hand, firm and steady. The tension that had defined the flight dissolved between them. What remained was a shared stillness that did not need explanation. The worry that had built for hours found its way out through silence rather than tears. They did not talk much. There was no need. The connection between them felt stronger than words. The quiet carried meaning now. It was not avoidance. It was healing. As the medical checks concluded, Anna's thoughts drifted back to the moment on the plane when she had chosen not to turn around. She remembered the pressure to react, to speak, to defend herself loudly. She also remembered why she had not. That decision, once questioned, now felt certain. She had protected what mattered most. Outside the room, the situation continued to unfold without her involvement. Mark faced the reality of legal consequences with no one left to shield him. The authority he once relied on had disappeared. There were no explanations that could undo what had been witnessed. Accountability had replaced control. Claire's fall was just as swift. One flight had stripped away the image she carried so carefully. Reputation collapsed under the weight of evidence. There was no dramatic confrontation, only process. The loss of status was complete. News of the incident spread quickly. Reports appeared, framed by footage and testimony. Commentary followed. Opinions formed. The story grew beyond the airport walls. Anna chose not to be part of it. She declined interviews. She declined attention. Her focus remained inward, on recovery, on safety, on the life she carried. Emily completed her final report with precision. Every detail was documented. Every step was verified. The responsibility she carried as a professional was fulfilled fully and without compromise. When the work was done, she closed the file and set it aside. The role had been honored. The flight itself became history, a number on a schedule, a record in a system. Yet, for those who had been there, it remained something more. It had been a moment when lines were crossed and then redrawn, when silence gave way to action, when protection took shape in the air. Anna sat by the window overlooking the runway, watching planes arrive and depart. The motion felt distant now. Her reflection in the glass looked calmer. The fear that once filled her eyes had softened into resolve. She had survived the worst part. What came next would be different. Emily stood beside her, a quiet presence. She was no longer acting under protocol. She was simply there. Family, support, proof that Anna was not alone. They spoke briefly about what would happen next. Appointments, rest, time. The future was approached carefully, without urgency. There was no need to rush healing. The world outside continued at its usual pace. Travelers hurried past. Announcements echoed. None of it pressed in. The space around Anna felt protected, insulated from chaos. Mark's path moved in the opposite direction, guided by law rather than choice. There would be hearings, questions, consequences. No one intervened on his behalf. The absence of protection mirrored the absence of accountability he had shown earlier. Claire faded from the immediate scene, absorbed into procedure and record. Her earlier dominance meant nothing now. The shift was complete. Anna did not feel satisfaction in their downfall. There was no sense of victory. What she felt was closure, the recognition that harm had been acknowledged and addressed. That was enough. Media coverage continued to build. Speculation followed. Anna remained unseen. She protected her child from the noise, choosing privacy over exposure. That choice felt powerful in its simplicity. Emily stayed with her until the last form was signed and the last instruction given. When it was time to leave, they walked out together. Not hurried, not hesitant, just steady. The memory of the flight lingered, but it no longer controlled her. Anna understood that the silence she had chosen earlier was not weakness. It had been strategy. It had preserved her strength until protection arrived. As they stepped into the open space beyond the terminal, Anna paused briefly. She took in the air, the light, the sense of ground beneath her feet. The worst moment had passed. Emily stood close, a constant point of balance. Family remained, support remained. That knowledge anchored everything else. There was no vow of revenge, no promise of retribution, only truth, acknowledged and recorded. That was sufficient. From this moment forward, Anna would not walk alone.